Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really interesting set of findings from a 1993 article by Linda Nielsen, all about students from divorced and blended families.
Mm,
You shared this with us, hoping to move beyond some of the usual assumptions and get a clearer, research-backed view of what truly shapes these young people's experiences in school as family structures change.
yeah,
Our mission today is really to unpack Nielsen's research, highlight what might surprise you, and really dig into the questions she explores about their grades, behavior, attitudes, and how schools can best offer support. So let's just get right into it.
absolutely. And it's fascinating looking back at this research from the early 90s. Nielsen really sets the stage by emphasizing just how significant the shift in family structures was becoming then.
Right.
She points out that by the year 2000, projections suggested only about 30% of students would live with both biological parents throughout their teenage years.
Wow. Only
Okay.
30%.
Yeah, that's a huge change. It suggests that, the majority of students were likely to experience single parent or blended family life during those really formative times.
And the numbers she cites for single parent households back then are quite striking, too. She mentions that a large percentage of children, particularly Black children, we're talking 85 to 95%, would spend at least a year in a single parent family before even reaching the age of 18.
That really underscores why this kind of research was so vital at that point.
Definitely.
It was a period of significant societal transition, and understanding the impact on children was, well, paramount. However, what's really valuable about Nielsen's article is that she immediately points out some crucial limitations in the research that had come before. It wasn't all straightforward.
Okay, so what were some of the key blind spots or shortcomings she identified in that earlier work?
Well, one of the major issues she highlights is a potential built-in slant in much of the initial research. Many researchers seem to start with this underlying idea that children in non-traditional families were automatically at a disadvantage or coming from what were often termed broken homes.
Hmm. That kind of starting point could have really shaped the findings, right? With researchers perhaps focusing more on problems and not necessarily looking for evidence of positive adjustment or resilience.
Exactly. If you're going into something expecting to find difficulties, you're probably more likely to see them or, interpret things in that light.
Makes complete sense.
And connected to that, Nielsen points out a significant lack of good comparison data. Many studies looked at children in single-parent or blended families without having a solid control group of children living with both biological parents.
So without that baseline, it's really hard to determine if the differences observed were actually due to the family structure itself or other factors entirely.
Precisely. It's like saying these kids are struggling, but without knowing if kids in two-parent homes were facing similar struggles, maybe for different reasons.
Right, right.
And she also raises the issue of how the research samples were often put together. A lot of the data came from families who were already seeking help or were identified as troubled, rather than being representative of the broader population of divorced or blended families.
Okay, so that could again lead to an overestimation of the difficulties children were facing.
Yeah, this background is so important as we look at the specific findings she discusses.
Right. It gives us a much more critical eye to examine the data through. So, keeping those limitations in mind, what were some of the key factors Nielsen identifies that do seem to have a significant impact on how students fare after a divorce beyond just the fact of the divorce itself?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Nielsen emphasizes that divorce isn't a single event with a predictable, uniform outcome.
Hmm.
She identifies a number of key factors that really come into play.
Like what?
These include the family's financial situation after the divorce, how often the child has contact with their father, the amount of conflict between the parents both before and after the separation, whether the mother remarries, and even the child's own personality and academic skills before the divorce.
Wow, that's a lot of interconnected pieces. It's definitely not as simple as just saying divorce automatically leads to negative results.
Not at all. And when you consider all these interacting variables, Nielsen points to some really compelling, large-scale studies that push back against those initial assumptions we talked about.
Okay.
For example, she mentions surveys of thousands of high school and younger students that found no long-lasting differences in things like grades, self-esteem, or behavior between kids from divorced and non-divorced families when you took into account factors like parenting style.
Wow, that's a pretty significant finding right there. It suggests that maybe the way parents act is more important than whether they're still together.
That seems to be a key insight. One study of 10,000 high schoolers found that what they called Authoritative parenting, being supportive, setting clear boundaries, and involving kids in decision-making was a much stronger predictor of positive outcomes than whether their parents were married or divorced.
So kids with those authoritative parents, regardless of family structure.
Right. They tended to have better grades, were more self-reliant, less anxious, less depressed, and less likely to get into trouble.
That's powerful. And she mentions another large survey as well, doesn't she?
Yes, a survey of 7,000 students aged 6 to 17 showed no significant differences between children of divorced and non-divorced parents across a whole range of measures,
Like what kind of measure?
including their emotional development, physical health, relationships with friends, how they were adjusting to school, their academic performance, and even their IQ scores.
Okay, so these findings really challenge the basic idea that divorce inherently leads to negative outcomes for children across the board.
Yeah, they really do.
So, if the divorce itself isn't the main cause of long-term problems, what about some of those other factors she mentioned? Let's talk about the economic impact, because that feels like it could create some pretty significant challenges.
You're absolutely right. While the long-term academic or behavioral effects of divorce itself might be less direct than we often assume, the article really emphasizes the very real and often immediate impact of reduced family income.
Yeah, the statistics from the early 90s are quite stark, aren't they?
They are. She mentions that a much smaller percentage of children in mother-only households had incomes of $20,000 or more compared to those in two-parent homes.
And the other side of that coin is even more concerning.
Exactly. Nearly half of all divorced mothers at that time had incomes below $10,000 a year.
$10,000, wow.
And this kind of economic downturn can lead to a whole series of difficulties for children having to move to a less expensive home, switch schools, and lose their social connections.
Dealing with more crowded living situations, losing access to activities and things they were used to having.
Right. It's not just about the money itself, is it? It's about the stability and the resources that money provides.
Precisely. And it also puts a lot of strain on the parent, usually the mother, who may have to go back to work or take on extra jobs, potentially having less time and energy for the children. Nielsen even points out that children themselves might feel pressure to get part-time jobs to help out, which can directly interfere with their schoolwork, especially if they were already struggling.
Hmm.
So it's clear how economic hardship following divorce can create real obstacles for students, even if the change in family structure isn't the primary cause.
Absolutely.
What about the role of the father's involvement after the divorce? That feels like another area with a lot of potential impact.
It definitely does. The research from that time indicated a significant decrease in contact between children and their fathers after divorce.
Yeah, you mentioned some studies from the late 80s showing a majority hadn't seen their father in the past year.
Right, and only a small percentage saw them on a weekly basis. Those are pretty low numbers.
So what did the research suggest about the impact of that reduced contact?
Interestingly, Nielsen points out a connection. Children who did maintain frequent contact with their fathers tended to show better self-confidence, higher grades, and fewer behavioral problems.
Okay, but there's a caveat there, isn't there?
Yes, she's careful to note that these fathers were often better educated and more financially stable. So it suggests that it might not be just the contact itself, but also the resources and support these fathers could provide.
So it could be a mix of factors at play.
Exactly. And importantly, the research also cautions that frequent contact in situations where there's still a lot of conflict between the parents could actually undo any potential benefits.
So the quality of the interaction, or maybe the absence of conflict, is really crucial.
That makes sense. Constant arguing, even if both parents are physically present sometimes, is likely to be harmful.
Speaking of conflict, the article really emphasizes the negative effects of parental conflict on children, right?
Absolutely. This was a consistently strong finding across many of the studies Nielsen looked at. Witnessing parental arguments was linked to a whole range of negative outcomes for children.
Like increased aggression, lower self-confidence.
Poorer social skills, lower grades, and higher rates of depression. And this isn't just about older kids who can understand the conflict, is it? She mentions even very young children are affected.
Right. Even children as young as 18 months showed signs of distress when their parents argued. And older preschoolers were often observed trying to get involved in their parents' quarrels.
And the extended period of tension and uncertainty that many children experience before, during, and after a divorce, with trial separations and not knowing what's going to happen, further adds to this stress.
It sounds like that ongoing conflict can create a really unhealthy environment for children, regardless of whether the parents are still living in the same house or not. Now, one of the points that I found particularly interesting was the idea that many of the problems observed in children after divorce actually started before the separation. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, this is a really important point that challenges the simple idea that divorce directly causes problems.
Hmm.
Longitudinal studies showed that issues like poor grades and behavioral difficulties were often present years before the parents actually divorced.
So it's not that the divorce caused the problems, but rather that the underlying issues in the marriage might have been contributing to difficulties for the children all along.
Exactly. One study Nielsen mentions that looked at different cultures found that problems like poor grades, temper tantrums, difficulty concentrating, and being easily upset were present in children years before their parents divorced.
Hmm.
And when these pre-existing issues were taken into account, the apparent impact of the divorce itself on boys' behavior and grades largely disappeared and was redeemed for girls as well.
Wow. So this really suggests that marital discord and tension within the family could be a more significant underlying factor than the legal act of divorce itself.
It's a really important distinction to make. It shifts the focus from the divorce as the sole cause to a potentially longer period of family stress.
Okay. The article also touches on gender differences in children's initial reactions to divorce. What did the research suggest there?
Well, initially, boys tended to show more outward behaviors, such as being more aggressive and having more trouble in school,
Right.
while girls were more inclined to keep their feelings inside, perhaps becoming withdrawn or depressed.
But that didn't necessarily last.
Right. Some research from that time found that these gender differences often became less clear over time. And the article also mentioned something about children living with a parent of the same sex.
Yes, that was another interesting point. Research suggested that children living with their same-sex parent generally showed better adjustment
Better adjustment in what way?
in terms of things like social maturity, how well they cooperated with others, and their self-confidence compared to those living with the opposite-sex parent.
Okay, and given that the vast majority of children in divorced families lived with their mothers.
Right. This could partly explain why boys might initially face more challenges.
That makes sense. And what about the mother's relationship with the ex-husband? Did that play a role?
It did, particularly for sons. The research indicated that when a mother had negative feelings towards her ex-husband, she was more likely to see those negative traits in her son.
Ooh, interesting.
And this negative view from the mother was also linked to sons feeling like their mothers were less supportive and more controlling, and these boys, in turn, were more likely to act aggressively at school.
So the relationship between the parents, even after they've separated, can continue to have a significant impact on the children. Wow.
Yeah, it's complex. Now let's move on to the impact of the mother's remarriage, because that's another big change in family structure. What did the research from that time suggest about how it affected children?
Overall, the research indicated that children tended to do better academically, emotionally, and financially if their mother remarried, compared to if she remained single.
Okay, so why was that?
Well, stepfathers could provide much-needed financial stability, improve the mother's overall well-being, and help establish more predictable family routines.
So it could provide a return to some sense of normalcy and security.
In many ways, yes. Nielsen points out that single mothers sometimes have a more peer-like relationship with their children and may rely on them more for emotional support,
Hmm,
whereas remarried mothers are often better able to provide the kind of structure and routine that supports success in school and other settings where there are clear rules.
that makes sense. She also mentions that children in single-parent homes who are often left unsupervised after school were more likely to engage in risky behaviors.
Right. But interestingly, the article also mentioned a potential difference in how sons and daughters reacted to their mother's remarriage.
Yes, that was a nuanced finding. A mother's remarriage seemed to be particularly beneficial for sons, often leading to a decrease in aggression and academic problems.
Okay, but not necessarily for daughters.
Daughters, on the other hand, sometimes experience some initial difficulties, especially younger girls. However, the overall well-being of both sons and daughters was closely tied to their mother's emotional and financial recovery.
Which was often helped by remarriage.
Exactly. So it sounds like the mother's happiness and stability are really important for the children's adjustment, regardless of the new family structure.
That seems key. The article also goes into the assessment tools that were being used back in the early 90s to understand how children and adults were reacting to divorce and blended families. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, Nielsen gives a good overview of various questionnaires and scales used at the time. For children, there were tools like the Children's Divorce Adjustment Scale and the Children's Beliefs about Parental Divorce Scale.
And what were those trying to measure?
They aim to understand their feelings and thoughts about the divorce. Things like sadness, anger, fear of being abandoned, and whether they hoped their parents would get back together. So, trying to get a direct sense of the child's perspective.
Okay.
There were also measures like the divorce events schedule for children, which asked kids about how often certain events happened in their families and how they felt about them.
And what about looking at the broader family dynamics?
Right. Tools like the family relationship inventory and the family environment scale were used to assess things like how much conflict there was, how close family members felt, and how well they communicated.
And how are they measuring the impact on the children themselves in terms of their overall well-being?
Well, traditional ways of measuring self-esteem, like the personal attribute inventory for children and the Piers-Harris self-concept scale, were commonly used. To understand emotional distress, there was the child depression scale. And to see how children were doing in school, instruments like the child rating scale, which looked at their academic abilities, anxiety levels, social skills, and self-confidence, as well as the well-known child behavior checklist, were used to get feedback from both parents and teachers.
Wow, so this really shows the efforts that were being made to develop objective ways to understand the different ways these family transitions could affect children.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the variety of tools they were using to try and capture all these different aspects.
Definitely. The article ends by talking about how schools could better support students from divorce and blended families. What were some of Nielsen's main suggestions in that area?
Her suggestions really focused on a few key areas. First, she emphasized the need for schools to educate their staff, teachers, counselors, principals,
Educate them about what specifically?
to challenge those negative stereotypes about children from divorce and blended families and to make them aware of what the research actually showed.
Because it sounds like there might have been a gap between what the research was finding and the assumptions that some people in schools might have had.
Exactly. She also highlighted the importance of creating inclusive classroom environments
How so?
with activities and materials that reflect the diverse family structures of students, being careful to avoid language that could be hurtful, and updating assignments to consider potential changes in families' financial situations.
So, making sure that kids from single-parent or blended families don't feel singled out or at a disadvantage in the classroom.
Exactly. On a policy level, she suggested things like offering childcare during school events to make it easier for single parents to participate,
That's practical.
providing more after-school programs for supervision, and making sure that both parents, including step-parents, receive separate school communications and are invited to events.
That makes a lot of practical sense, recognizing that divorced parents might not be able to coordinate things easily or even want to attend together.
Right. And she also stressed the important role of school counseling programs.
Okay, what could they do?
These programs could help students understand that the divorce isn't their fault, address the different ways boys and girls might react to divorce, especially the outward aggression sometimes seen in boys, and offer support for single parents, too.
And did she mention specific types of counseling?
She even mentioned that group counseling programs showed promise in helping students develop better coping skills and improve their self-esteem.
So, a multifaceted approach involving education, inclusive practices, policy changes, and targeted support services.
That's a good summary. Nielsen really laid out a thoughtful vision for how schools could be more understanding and supportive of this growing group of students.
Yeah, she really did.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say are the main things someone listening should take away from this, whether they're a student, a parent, or maybe someone who works in education?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is just how complex this issue really is. It's clear from this research, even back in 1993, that the impact of divorce and blended families on students has many layers and can't be boiled down to simple, negative stereotypes.
Right.
The family's financial situation and the level of conflict between parents consistently stand out as really important factors, often having a bigger impact than just the change in family structure itself.
That's key.
And the research also reminds us that many children are resilient and can adjust well, especially when there's support and positive factors like a mother's remarriage, perhaps.
And did any of these findings particularly stand out to you, even looking back at them now from, decades later?
I think the emphasis on the problems that existed before the divorce is always quite striking. The idea that academic and behavioral difficulties often predate the separation really challenges that immediate cause and effect way we sometimes think about it.
Yeah, it really does.
And the nuanced way that remarriage seemed to affect sons and daughters differently is another point that reminds us to look beyond general trends and consider individual experiences.
Definitely. It gives you something to think about in terms of how these trends and understandings might have changed over the last 30 years or so.
Absolutely.
What new things might researchers be focusing on today, and how have the ways schools try to help adapted? This 1993 research really gives us a valuable historical perspective.
It absolutely does. It makes you wonder, for example, about the role of technology and social media in family dynamics today, or how our understanding of co-parenting has developed since then.
Good points.
This deep dive really just gives us a starting point for a fascinating and constantly evolving area.
Well, we hope this has given everyone listening a much richer and more nuanced understanding of this topic. What further questions does this raise for you? Are there specific areas you might be interested in exploring in future deep dives? We're always interested to hear your thoughts.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us today on the Deep Dive.